So today we are speaking with Tim Heyman, who is going to talk to us a little bit about his experience in emerging markets and some perhaps predictions for the Emerging Markets Institute at Johnson at Cornell University. So Tim, would you mind just speaking a little bit initially about your background and involvement in the Emerging Markets Institute?
Okay, well, beginning with emerging markets, you can probably tell from my accent that I'm English. I was born in England, educated in England, but international parents. So I began, in fact, my core competence is languages and linguistics. So I've learned about 10 different languages at all different times. So having done Latin and Greek at Oxford, I then went to MIT to study business and information systems. And then I went into the City of London, into the international bond market in a bank called Rothschild's, a similar name to your own name, Jennifer. Anyway, but I was in the birth of the international bond markets, the Eurobond market in the early 70s. So I was kind of born international with all these languages. And actually I'd been around the world by the time I was 22. Because by the time I was 24, because I went back from MIT via Asia. So I've been all the way, so I've been this sort of internationalist person. So I spent 6 years in London, the City of London, on the international finance side, beginning with the Eurobond market, then North Sea oil financing, nuclear plant financing, and then I was asked to go to Mexico 43 years ago, 1976. And nobody remembers what England was like or Britain was like in the 70s, but it was kind of depressed. There was the oil collapse and everything, and there was a Labour government and strikes and everything, 3-day weeks and so on. So it didn't, because of I keep on insisting on my international background, it took no effort to convince me to go to Mexico. In fact, I arrived in Mexico in November 1976 in the middle of a crisis. Its first evaluation in 22 years. I've been there ever since. So it's a weird combination of cultures, the English education, then the American, and then Mexico. So that's relevant to my immersion in Mexico, where I've been for 43 years and basically most of my career here in finance. And I've gone from being a corporate finance guy. I left Rothschild's in 79, then I went into a Mexican broker. I lived through the growth of the Mexican brokerage industry from 1979 to 1990. Then I joined a bank called Barings, the other great English investment bank. And we developed a business throughout Latin America. We grew from Mexico to Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru and Colombia. We developed a huge business from nothing, from me to 300 people. Very interesting. Then I had the interesting experience of going bust in 1995. There was a gentleman called Nicholas Leeson who blew up the bank. That was an interesting experience. I was old enough not to be traumatized by it. Then I've been teaching at one of the best economics and finance universities in Latin America called ITAM. But I've been part-time, but I took a year off and wrote my 7th and 8th books there, reflecting on my career and also on emerging markets. And I was actually very much part of the growth of Mexico as an emerging market. I, in fact, changed the law in Mexico. That's very presumptuous to say, but it so happened that the Minister of Finance was a friend of mine. He said, how can we get more foreign investment? So we changed the law in 1990, which allowed foreigners to invest in Mexican stocks. So in a sense, I created my own business, my own industry. And in fact, it was because Barings was the great emerging markets broker. They'd begun in the Far East. They'd begun in Japan in the mid-'80s, and they'd turned Japan from being an emerging market into being a global market. Then they moved to different parts of Asia. They moved to Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, Thailand, Indonesia, and they then, through the demand of their clients, they said, why don't we go to Latin America? So they hired me to set up a Latin American operation for them. But we were the emerging markets research house. So I was part of that whole process. And within Mexico, we opened Mexico up to foreign investment. In fact, I was the banker. I then went, having been an investment banker and being a broker, I was an investment banker. I was in fact an investment banker to a man called Carlos Slim, who became the richest guy in the world. He wasn't at that time, but we took him public, and various other major Mexican companies, which have become what Lourdes now specializes in emerging markets, multinationals, but this was the beginning of that whole process. And anyway, after Barings, I went back to school, wrote about it. Then I started my own company in 1997, and as an investment management company, and built that up. And I sold out to Franklin Templeton, the major American investment management company, also a global company, in 2013. So I've been the head of the president of their Mexican operation since then. So that's my quick history. Now that's me and emerging markets. Now the EMI, Lourdes's daughter, was at my Oxford College, and she won a scholarship to come to Mexico, and a delightful person, and we spent some time with her. And it was through her daughter that I met Lourdes. It so happened she was in the same thing. And this was about 2015, and she invited me to be involved with the emerging, I guess 5 years, it's incredible how time, but it had only been going for 5 years. I didn't even think about the history of the emerging markets, but she's such an open person and so inclusive that it was amazing that we should have so much in common. She was looking at emerging markets from the sort of bottom-up perspective, which in fact is what I'd done when I was Barings, because we were the first people who produced serious research on emerging market companies, Barings. So it's something I'd been doing when I was at Barings and have been doing ever since. So this was something she'd really developed, because when she got involved with emerging market is when they were really emerging in 2010. So that was the approach, and she had relationships in Mexico, but obviously we clicked both personally and professionally. I also had a chance to meet Sumitra, her husband. So she then invited me to Cornell to give a talk in an emerging markets leaders conference, which was to me an interesting challenge, because the thing is, when you have been building a business, when you've merged your company with another larger company like Franklin Templeton, you are very, very busy. But suddenly she asked me to talk about emerging markets and everything else. And I think it was in March 2016 that I gave a talk at Ithaca to her class. And it was actually about, I decided to ask the question in this book. So I suddenly asked the question because I hadn't been involved with, I'd actually given talks at MIT, my alma mater, and at Harvard, and at Oxford, and at University of South California about Mexico. But I haven't given a philosophical talk about finance. In fact, what I studied at Oxford was not just Roman and Greek literature, also history and philosophy. So I started getting philosophical about finance and saying, well, what's the point of finance? If apparently, and I decided I was going to talk to students about this emerging market students about, and I thought it'd be interesting to exchange ideas with them. People from it was a remarkable group which Lourdes had put together. We're talking in 2016 from all over the world, from India, from China, from Latin America, from other places. So finance seems to have been good for financiers. Has it been good for the world? So I then chose that as a subject. That was what the book was about. And from then on in, I've been involved with not just on this sort of broader philosophical view of finance, but also we produce monthly reports on Mexico, which I showed to Lourdes and said, well, why don't we put them on the emerging markets website? So we've had this collaboration every year. So it's a detailed financial, political, economic view of Mexico from the inside. And so it's interesting to focus on a specific country. That's the second collaboration. The third one was, as I've been involved with the conferences which occur every November at the Cornell Tech since, I guess, 2017, 2018, 2019, where we have and we also have meetings of the advisory board, which is a very interdisciplinary and or global country. So I've met people from, obviously from India, from China, from Colombia, Brazil, very fascinating interaction.
Looking back at the progress that emerging markets have made in the last decade, we focus, a lot of the recent research that we've been doing has come out of looking at China specifically from 2010 onwards. So I was hoping that you might be able to speak a little bit to the progress that Mexico has made perhaps in the last decade.
Right. Well, Mexico is an extraordinary, I mean, I've been very, very privileged because there are all kinds of reasons that you sort of make your own luck, but I sort of, first of all, my wonderful wife, who couldn't be more Mexican, but, you know, I mean, she's involved in culture. She ran the Mexican country's arts festival, one of the best in the world. And because of her family background, but you know, her mother was best friends with Diego Rivera, the painter, and Siqueiros. And I met Siqueiros' wife, and Siqueiros' wife's husband tried to kill Trotsky. So I met all these people. Mexico is, of all Latin America, has the strongest identity and the strongest culture. I think culture is one of the most important hallmarks. I mean, beginning with pre-Aztecs, the Mayas, before them, the Olmecs. I mean, the most extraordinary depth of culture and the fact that it was the jewel and the crown of the Spanish Empire. It was where all the silver came from, the stories of Hernan Cortez, and then the independence, then the arrival of Maximilian and Carlota, then the revolution of 1911, and all the traces of Mexico is very much embedded in its history. And it's not quite yet emerged, that's the word. I mean, people are still arguing about independence, revolution, everything, but it hasn't quite come out. But I think you've got to begin with the culture, and then you begin with the modern development of Mexico. I lived it because in 1976, it had its first devaluation in 22 years. Then we crashed in 82 because the president at that time made some very bad decisions. He was turning back towards, you might call it a level of socialism. And then, but the last hurrah of the whole period of Mexican socialist, the bookends are the nationalization of the oil industry in 1938 and the nationalization of the banks in 1982. Those are the bookends of the socialization of Mexico. And then there was the reversal following 1982. In fact, it's very interesting that the president, a man called De la Madrid, he decided that Mexico had to become more global. And so gradually Mexico began to change. It began to privatize companies. The banks began to be re-privatized, various companies. And then a man called Carlos Salinas de Gortari came in 1988, and he really went full speed towards modernizing the country. He did two very important things. One, he officially privatized the bank. The second thing, he organized the North American Free Trade Agreement with America. That was an absolute game breaker. It was approved on November the 18th, 1993, and it went into effect in 1994. It was huge. It completely changed Mexico. It provided a framework for approved foreign investment in Mexico. The president, we then had a crazy year in 1994 where the presidential candidate was assassinated, and then the leader of the PRI was assassinated. That was the economic process. What then happened, the political process, we had a monopoly political party from 1929 to 2000, a party called the PRI, the Partido de la Revolución Institucional. So we had a change of party, a new president from a different party, a man called Vicente Fox, 2000 to 2006. That accentuated even more the modernization of Mexico. Then we had another 6 years of the PAN, a very closely fought battle between a man called Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who lost the election by 0.2%, like George Bush, whenever that was way back in the year 2000. Then we had the PRI came back in 2012 to 2018, but suddenly what happened was the man who'd lost the election in 2006, this man Andrés Manuel López Obrador, a bit like Lula in Brazil and Mitterrand in France, at the third time of asking, he won the election. Now he's a socialist throwback. The Mexican energy industry, there was a tremendous energy reform which opened up the energy sector so that companies apart from Pemex could drill for oil and go into partnership because they had the technology and the money. But also for the electricity industry, which was very important, they opened up the industry to renewables, which was wind and solar. And what recently happened is that a Mexican government agency decreed that ongoing wind and solar energy could not be used to generate energy. They would only use energy which was generated from fossil fuels, except the existing plants, but the new plants have been completely put on hold. There's at least $10 billion or $20 billion of investment and like $20 billion in the pipeline. So I'm saying we have all these things going on, which mean that it's the most extraordinary change with this extraordinary march to modernization. In fact, I wrote an article which was published in a Yale University Press book in 2011. The title says it's called Mexico's Interminable Modernization. In my business, you have to think of what's called upside risk. There's a risk things might go right. And in my business, if you haven't climbed on the train before it starts going, you're in bad shape. So you've got to worry about what if things go right. So I'm saying, my view is it seems almost what I've just said to you, and I'm sure it sounds completely incredible what I told you about the wind and solar energy situation. Having been going, absolutely towards South Korea, I wrote another, in 1993, I wrote another, because Mexico was doing so well, we were the second largest emerging market in the world after Thailand, $200 billion market cap, which at that time was like, amazing. I mean, it's nothing now when Apple is worth $1 trillion or something, but in those days it was huge. And I wrote a very self-conscious article in May for an outfit called Bank Credit Analyst saying, is Mexico still an emerging market? And I said, the very act I'm asking this question, I'm tempting fate. And sure enough, it collapsed in 1994. We had the tequila crisis. So I'm saying I've been through all these cycles. So this is yet another cycle. So I'm kind of philosophical. I personally think that despite everything, there is a level of common sense. Like, you know, his popularity has gone down. We now have opinion polls, and, you know, we have an election next year of in midterm elections of the. I think in the end that reality, but that's because that's just in my DNA. I may be wrong, but I'm saying we have to look at all the possible. I may be wrong, but I think that, you know, even Mexico will face the ultimate stress test.
You touched on this a little bit, talking about sort of Mexico enduring the stress test, but do you have any thoughts more generally about the role that emerging markets might play as we sort of enter a new global paradigm?
So the dialectic post COVID is that nothing will ever be the same again. The world is ineffably changed. And the other is everything will be changed, so we'll just say the same, right? My residual belief is I also believe in technology, and I keep a close tab on the development of tests, of cures, and of vaccines for COVID. I know a lot less about this than Bill Gates. He thinks there'll be a vaccine by the end of next year. In fact, my own university has one, Oxford University has one of the most promising. It works on rhesus monkeys. So they're now trying it on human volunteers. 6,000 volunteers. An Indian believes so much, he's actually started building an $85 million plant even before the vaccine has been proved. Now, emerging markets, I think, obviously China's, I think the issue of outsourcing is a big point. There's no question that China had taken away the whole market, but as costs had gone up, the first point is that coronavirus is the ultimate stress test. If you want, they talk about takeaways and business schools and bullet points and all this kind of stuff. The second point is that coronavirus is simply accelerating a whole lot of things which were happening anyway. Outsourcing was already going on, and people were buying their stuff from Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and Burma, which China was already getting too expensive. And Mexico was a beneficiary. And the supply chains, that will carry, it's just going to carry on that process. But meanwhile, I mean, the sense of onsourcing too, yes, but I'm saying I go back to the point, I'm saying that we're in peak pandemic, right? I think the core question on China is the political question. Obviously, economically, it's done amazingly well. The extent to which, you know, the business of, we talked about this endlessly with Russia in the 90s, the perestroika and glasnost. You've had perestroika on the economy, you haven't had glasnost. Perestroika means restructuring. Russian is one of my languages, one of the 10. Glasnost means openness. So the openness is not there, heavily censorship, but they've restructured the economy. The political thing hasn't happened. China talking about its currency and all these other things. I mean, they're talking about a new currency, a China reserve currency. I mean, does anybody believe any of the numbers in China which the government produces about its economy? Let's take the so-called Washington post-war consensus, which is that the right system for the world is capitalism and democracy. And my general view of it, for what it's worth, is the reason why people are still questioning it is simply because it is a very, very, very complicated system. Democracy is very complicated and capitalism is very complicated. And basically, if you've been badly treated by the consensus for whatever reason, or you're mentally lazy, You prefer to try and keep it simple, and you rage against the consensus instead of going with it and trying to make it better. In fact, I've got an uncle who was an economist, a man called Albert Hirschman, who wrote a book about this called Exit, Voice and Loyalty, which is, if you're in a system, he was brought up in Nazi Germany. Well, when it was becoming Nazi, left in 1933, he ended up as professor of economics at Princeton. But exit, voice or loyalty, if you don't believe in a system, do you speak up and try and change it? Or do you leave? But that's exit. And the level to which you speak up is the extent of loyalty you have towards. He talks about everything, families, organizations, country, because he lived through the whole thing. Either you get a divorce, or you leave the company, or you leave the country, or you try and make it better. So that's basically, I'm in the position of I'm in the voice school when it comes to improving democracy and capitalism. But it's very complicated. Most people are too lazy or too tired or too bored or too poor to be able to bother about it.
So what we're thinking about at the Emerging Markets Institute is where do we fit in now? At least if we've been talking about
concerns. The EMI fit in. I think that in a weird way, if you think about Americans within America or Brits within Britain, they just talk about their own little world, and they talk about their financial markets and the detail of the balance sheets and the inflation numbers and how you calculate GDP and all this little small stuff, the sort of detail that the angels on the head of a pin stuff, whereas in emerging markets, because why they've got a more or less a structure, and I think that you can't operate in these markets without not just talking about it, but doing stuff about it. And I told you I changed the law on foreign investment in this country. I mean, you may say, I could tell you the detail. I was asked my opinion by the Minister of Finance. He said, how could we do it? And I said, this is what you should do. And he followed my advice. That's it. So I'm saying you have to create your own environment. But it's the same about in any world, in any country. I mean, if it happens to be something political you do, that's what you do, because you change the law. In America, you change the technology, which then changed the law. But
it's definitely, I mean, inescapably entwined, pretty much.
Good work.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the conversations that we've been having have been focused on, there was such rapid globalization in the last decade. Are we looking at possibly deglobalization and becoming more insular again? And if so, I guess how can the EMI add to and participate in the growth of emerging markets in terms of research, education, and engagement if there's this possibility of I guess contraction? And I guess there's maybe two questions there. Of one, if you think we're headed into a deglobalization situation.
Don't you think that's a possibility?
It's definitely one that we haven't entertained as much when we're discussing what the future. I think it's been a bit pessimistic.
No, but just think about it. Just think about the following thing. It's between an orgy or a wake, which to prefer. I mean, but I'm saying that, look, now the two major plagues, I read about the plague at Athens, which was 430 BC to 427 BC, right? And so I was brought up on this stuff. Fast forward, the bubonic plague in the 14th century, 1351, in Europe, and in the Black Death in England. And then in Europe, 1665. You know what people did after the plague? The ones who survived it, they went on orgies. That's the opposite of contraction.
Yeah.
Because they were happy to be alive. Just put it this way. You get a vaccine, right? And you're told you're not going to get the thing. So why don't you act normally? You haven't had a party for a year and a half. Isn't it going to be a better and bigger party? Um, but the other point is that we've never had 7.8 billion people worried about the same thing in the history of the world. And why? Because we don't understand. Because any of us might die. I mean, you might die far less likely than me. It's just a sheer age thing. But I'm saying, but I think that is what makes us so really worried. The Spanish flu, 1919, look at what happened in the 20s. It was the most glorious decade ever. Why shouldn't it happen again?
I wanted to focus the scope a lot smaller back, since, technically we're supposed to be thinking also about the 10th anniversary of the Emerging Markets Institute. I guess, how do you think that the EMI can help supply the skills necessary for today's and tomorrow's MBA students to succeed in whatever this new paradigm happens to be?
Okay, well, I tell you, I now speak to my area of ignorance. I think that it's an unrivaled living laboratory. The world is, the world has been in an economic coma and a pandemic. How do you revive it? Where do you start? So I think that that's exactly where the EMI could do comparative, because it all depends on the institutional framework. How do you restart economies? Where do you start? This is in fact something which my uncle, this man Albert Hirschman, check him out. He wrote his first book in 1956 called The Strategy of Economic Development. The question was, how do you develop economies? This was because after the Second World War, before, the United Nations was founded with 48 countries. You then got decolonization. So suddenly you got all these new countries which didn't have mummy empire or anything. How in the hell do you start economies? So we now have the question, how do you start economies up? And you look at the existing institutional framework and you figure out a way of making predictions. No, you begin with the existing institutions. Then you have the policy reaction to the pandemic. Then you look at the opening method, then you try and figure out which one will do best in reopening its economy, given global interdependence and local dependence. So that would be a very, very interesting thing that the EMI could handle. What you start when, and also whether it's bottom up, whether to the extent to which it's done with the extent to which you have private public sector collusion, I mean, in the good word, of deciding what to do, and what are the determinants of the way in which economies open. But I think that's a very, very interesting set of things to research.
It'd be interesting to see how we can, I guess, address perhaps maybe a more internationally minded education going forward, perhaps for MBA students. A lot of the people who are the EMI fellows are from emerging market countries themselves. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about, I guess, encouraging, a more internationally minded business education, even for those who are not from, emerging countries.
The very fact that that the students come to the EMI means they will have a sense of comparativeness. So they should begin with their own country and then compare it with they can be I think I can't think of a better place than the business of looking at emerging markets institutions, which are not just the businesses, but the whole institutional environment, which I'm not aware that Cornell looks at.
Yeah, no, we're definitely at a turning point one way or another of at least trying to figure out the direction of, celebrating these milestones that we're having, and what does that mean going forward. And we're kind of not sure yet. So it's really great to speak with lots of, hate to use the businessy word stakeholders, but people who have their lots of experience in their hands in the pot, as it were. Well, thank you so much for taking so much time out of your day to chat with me and sort of just postulate and ponder about various different scenarios of where we might head and where we've been.